Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Congressman Chris Deluzio, a member of the For Country Caucus. Congressman, thank you so much for joining me.
Hey, Brittany, thanks for having me on.
The One Big Beautiful Bill Act, President Trump's nearly 1,000-page domestic policy legislation, was signed into law last week on 4th of July. You, along with every Democrat in the House, voted against it. So to start off the conversation, can you talk to us why you don't support this agenda?
Well, I think it's pretty easy. The bill will take away health care and more from a lot of Americans to pay for pretty reckless tax giveaways to some of the richest and most powerful corporations and people who have ever lived, and all while jacking up our debt in the order of trillions of dollars. And I think it's important here. It wasn't just all Democrats who voted against the bill. You had some Republicans vote against the bill as well. It tells you there was some bipartisan opposition here, which I shared the concerns on all those fronts, whether it was healthcare or food assistance, the fiscal irresponsibility. I actually was just meeting with some of the leaders of the building trades in Western Pennsylvania around Pittsburgh, talking about their concerns around the job killing parts of this bill. Even the National Building Trades Union called it perhaps the biggest job killing bill in the history of this country. And it did that, the bill, by taking away all of these tax credits that we're investing in lots of good new energy sources that now we'll see those jobs go away. And so I think all those things together really punched a wallop here, packed a wallop that could really hurt a lot of people in my part of the world and all over the country.
To your point, some Republicans in the House and Senate voted with Democrats against this bill. Senator Lisa Murkowski, she voted for it, but this is what she said while defending voting for the bill. Do I like this bill? No, but I tried to take care of Alaska's interests. But I know in many parts of the country there are Americans that are not going to be advantaged by this bill. What do you make of that type of thinking here that, hey, I mean, this is helping the constituents I serve in my state, but other Americans aren't going to be served by this bill? What do you make of that?
Well, certainly lots of Americans are going to get hurt, and I think a lot of Alaskans will too. I don't represent Alaska, but I can see the numbers on the healthcare cuts and all the rest, and what it would mean for her constituents, just the same as it would mean for mine. And I think our jobs are to fight hard for the people we represent and to fight hard for the country. And I look at this as the bill isn't just bad for Western Pennsylvania, where we see there are a bunch of hospitals at risk of closing. I've been hearing about concerns around nursing homes too. Again, lots of folks who will lose their health care, but that's playing out across the country. And so to me, standing up for Western Pennsylvania means the same as standing up for all Americans and voting against this bill. And again, I think it's important that you saw both some Republicans and all Democrats oppose the bill. So to see that bipartisan opposition mattered.
Economists largely have the same takeaway when it comes to this legislation, that the poorest in America actually stand to lose money when you factor in different cuts to different programs, and the richest in America will become richer. In your private conversations with Republicans, how are they squaring that?
You know, I think they're doing some magical math around the cost of the bill and the way the tax giveaways at the very top are going to happen. And I think they're better suited than me to describe their rationale for supporting the bill. But the impact on the deficit and the debt is pretty clear. We're talking trillions of new debt that my kids and everyone's kids and grandkids for generations to come will be stuck paying for. And I'm someone who thinks hardworking people, working class people in this country could use a tax cut. I'm all for bringing down taxes for hardworking people. What I'm not for is taking away health care and food assistance to pay for tax giveaways for powerful and profitable corporations and for people, and I'm not exaggerating, people who make billions of dollars a year. We could have easily passed a tax cut bill targeted for working class and middle class Americans, and we didn't have to do anything like take away health care to pay for tax giveaways at the very top, all while jacking up the debt through deficits each year. So I think it's fiscally reckless, and I really don't understand why the Republicans went down this path.
Congressman, I work for Forbes, so we talk about big numbers all day long. I want to wrap our head around this because this number is just so big. Estimates say the package adds close to $3.4 trillion to the national debt. So what exactly does that mean? If you're the average American, if you're a Pennsylvanian, and you hear that the debt is going up by trillions of dollars over the next decade, what specifically does that mean for you?
Look, you should be worried about it, right? Our country's fiscal standing matters. Our country's ability to pay our bills and to meet basic needs, to keep us safe, to guard against threats at home and abroad, to meet the promise of things like Social Security and Medicare. All of that gets put at risk when we take on all of this debt. And again, this is not debt that this country is taking on to go fight World War II. This is debt that this country is taking on to help pay for tax giveaways to big corporations and the richest people in the history of humankind. I think it's foolish and reckless. And, it's both conservative and liberal economists, it's experts who worry about our fiscal health who are sounding the alarm that just tacking on more and more debt, as you say, into the trillions, is putting our country in a dangerous place. It's really, I think, fiscally irresponsible. And once again, I don't understand why my Republican counterparts have gone down this path to take on all this new debt, to put us at fiscal risk, to jeopardize the country's ability to issue new debt, to put our credit rating at risk, all to pay for tax giveaways at the very top. I think it's foolish and doesn't make any sense to me.
And some Republicans are saying that number isn't accurate, that 3.4 trillion or adding trillions of dollars to the debt isn't accurate because you need to factor in the expansion of the tax cuts. What do you make of that, A? And B, is that a public PR spin? Are they saying that in private? I mean, what are those conversations with your Republican colleagues when it comes to the debt and deficit? Because Republicans have long touted themselves as deficit hawks.
Well, the evidence is pretty clear. When we have had Republican presidents, they've ballooned the debt much more than Democratic presidents, certainly in my lifetime. And look, I don't know what my Republican counterparts really think and believe about this, but as you say, lots of them talked for a long time about being hawks on the deficit. I talk about fiscal responsibility a lot. This is fiscal irresponsibility to pass this bill. And, what we have seen from the first Trump term, I wasn't in Congress yet, but the tax cuts there at the very top, they did not generate extra economic activity that would pay for the big, huge hit to the debt and the deficit each year. So that hasn't worked. And my constituents in Western Pennsylvania know this myth of trickle-down economics. It has not worked out for us. It's not worked out for the American people. It's not worked out for the country's balance sheet. And so I think, again, this is just a pretty reckless path to go down. And instead, what we should have done, what we should do, is tax relief for the wide expanse of American people, or working class, middle class, you name it, and to ask those who make hundreds of millions and billions of dollars to pay a little more in taxes. That's what this country has traditionally done. I sometimes cite the top tax rates when conservative Republican Dwight Eisenhower was president. They were double, if not more than double, what they are now for the richest Americans, who I know can afford to pay a little more.
Congressman, I would love to pick your brain just a bit on the timing of some of these features that are going into effect from the legislation. Some of the Medicaid changes go into effect after the 2026 midterm election. Some of the tax cuts are happening before. Do you think that timing is political in nature? What do you make of that?
I do think it's political. I think it's clearly political. And I'll tell you, I was taking some questions today from some union workers in the building trades asking me about the impact of this tax bill on overtime pay. And I was glad to see there's a little bit in there to give a deduction for overtime pay. I think it should be more generous. But here's the thing, that expires in 2028. But what doesn't expire is tax cuts for someone who makes $1 billion a year. It doesn't make sense. Again, I think it exposes just a really reckless approach from President Trump and congressional Republicans here.
Congressman, I would love to get your take and turn to things abroad and the situation specifically in the Middle East. Last month, the United States bombed multiple Iranian nuclear sites, involving us in a war between Iran and Israel. President Trump announced days after that the two countries reached a ceasefire agreement after a tumultuous 12 days of fighting. Now, President Trump says Iran wants to meet with the U.S. for talks. What do you make of where diplomacy now goes from here?
Look, I think diplomacy can succeed. I think it was important that the president secured a ceasefire agreement between the Israelis and the Iranians. And as I'm sure you know and your viewers know, the Trump administration was pursuing diplomacy with the Iranians before the decision to strike. I think it's wise, given how weakened the Iranians are, to try to reach an agreement to limit and make it impossible for them to obtain a nuclear weapon, which I think would be disastrous for our interest and for the region. And so I would urge any administration, I urge the last one, I urge this one, to try to reach a deal that can constrain the Iranians' ability to develop a nuclear weapon. We've got pretty clear data that when there was a nuclear agreement in place, the Iranians were enriching less uranium than they were able to enrich once the Trump administration took us out of the nuclear deal with the Iranians. That tells us that a deal with, I think, strict scrutiny and safeguards can work. The devil will be in the details, but I very much encourage this administration to get back to the negotiating table in diplomatic talks and try to hammer out a deal that can protect us and our interest in the region.
And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he touted the U.S. strikes as a historic victory that has already changed the face of the Middle East. What are your thoughts on that characterization?
Well, I think we've seen some jockeying back and forth from our own intelligence and defense community's assessment of the attacks. And as a member of the Armed Services Committee, as you can imagine, I won't get into the kinds of briefings I receive in those classified settings. But let's start with number one. I share the goal that the Iranians should not have a nuclear weapon, period. I'm also someone who believes deeply, and I've thought this whether there was a Democratic president or a Republican president, that we have seen presidents for too long ignore Congress's constitutional power here to decide whether we send Americans to war. And in my book, certainly sending Americans over the airspace of a foreign country and dropping bombs is the kind of conduct that only the Congress can authorize in this kind of strike. And so I've been disappointed to see this president do that. I've been disappointed in the past to see Democratic and Republican presidents ignore Congress. And I think Congress has to step in to assert its role and to frankly stand up for the American people who get to decide whether we send Americans into the hell of war, as I say. I'm a veteran of the war in Iraq. I know what it is to see our country deliberate and deliberate poorly, to be frank, as they did 20 plus years ago with the decision to invade Iraq.
And to that point, Congressman, after the U.S. struck the Iranian nuclear sites just a few weeks ago, there were real fears of a potential World War III, the United States entering another war in the Middle East. As someone who is a veteran, who was deployed to the Middle East, I mean, do you share those fears right now?
Yes, and I don't want to see us embroiled in another Middle Eastern war with who knows what timeline to end. So I'm glad to see that this ceasefire was brokered between the Israelis and the Iranians. I hope that it can hold. I hope that diplomacy can be successful with the Iranians to reach some agreement to block their development of a nuclear weapon and to give us some pretty strict safeguards in place. But certainly, I don't want to see young Americans fighting in another forever war in the Middle East. And I don't think that's a partisan position. I think if you ask veterans of my generation, Republican or Democrat, they tell you the same thing. They want our government to be much, much more careful about committing American lives and American treasure to fight. And I don't think it's in our interest to send Americans off to fight another war in the Middle East right now.
Congressman, I would love to end the conversation on a bipartisan note, and I really enjoy my conversations with members of the For Country Caucus because I think that Democrat or Republican, when you're in this caucus, you really want to try to find areas of agreement, areas of common ground, places where you can find solutions. So you introduced a new version of the Railway Safety Act with Republican For Country Caucus member Nick LaLota back in February, 2 years exactly to the day after the devastating train derailment that affected areas and communities in both Western Pennsylvania as well as Ohio. Can you talk to us first about the legislation?
I think it's really important, as you said, my constituents in Western Pennsylvania and our neighbors in East Palestine and beyond in Ohio lived through just a horrible day when that Norfolk Southern train derailed and we saw that toxic fireball into the sky. I mean, people all over the country saw it on the news. And while the news isn't paying as much attention anymore, we still need rail safety legislation. I think it's so important. That's been bipartisan. Nick LaLota, a fellow Naval Academy grad, For Country Caucus member, as you say, has been a great partner in that fight, along with Mike Ruley, who represents that part of Ohio. I think we can get this done. I think it's one of those rare opportunities where you've got Democrats and Republicans who know we need rail safety to get done. And for me, the For Country Caucus has been a place where I know I can find a willing Republican partner on issues where we can find some common ground. And I think what I and plenty of us in the group take to it is we all know what it is to put our country first. We've worn the uniform. We've served in different ways across a variety of regions and branches of service. But that mission first mentality means when there's a place that we can find common ground, I know those guys and gals are willing to try to work together. We need a little more of that in Congress, to be honest with you right now.
And so then to that note, I mean, what's next for this legislation?
I hope we can get a hearing in the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, where one of the committees I serve. I've made this point before, but it was one of the only bills that then President Biden and then candidate Trump agreed and supported. And so now, with J.D. Vance as vice president, who was one of my Senate leads on this bill, and President Trump and Democrats and Republicans in the Congress supporting the Railway Safety Act, let's pass the bill. That's my message to Republican leadership. As you see, you've got bipartisan buy-in. Let's get this thing passed into the president's desk to get signed.
Congressman, I really appreciate the time today. I appreciate the conversation. You are welcome back anytime. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for having me on.